The city of Tehran sleeps under a veil of calm, but in a quiet northeastern district, a storm of intelligence is about to descend. Inside a modest, unmarked warehouse, rows of steel safes sit silently, guarding decades of secrets. Two operatives move cautiously through the shadows, checking their watches. They have only 6 hours before dawn, before the guards return. And yet, one crucial fact remains unknown. One variable hidden within the walls of that warehouse could unravel the mission before a single document is touched. Before we start this mission, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these missions travel. If you love real spy wars like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next declassified file. Give this video a like, share it with someone who loves true spy stories. Tehran at night is a city of contrasts. The streets are quiet, yet beneath the surface, a complex web of surveillance, checkpoints, and security patrols operates relentlessly. Streetlights cast long shadows along boulevards that look ordinary, almost safe to the casual observer. But those who know the city intimately understand that the ordinary is deceptive. Beneath this urban calm, secret files lie waiting. Files that have long eluded the prying eyes of the world's intelligence agencies. Among them, a small warehouse in the Shorabad district would soon become the center of one of the most daring espionage operations in modern history. The Iranian nuclear program has always been more than a series of laboratories and centrifuges. It is a symbol of sovereignty, an emblem of national pride, and a testament to scientific achievement under extraordinary pressure. Decades of political upheaval, sanctions, and international scrutiny have shaped it into an institution both secretive and meticulous. For operatives seeking intelligence, this meant that success required more than skill. It demanded patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of the forces guarding the program from within. The warehouse itself was unremarkable at first glance. A brick facade, a single steel door, and a nondescript roofline, giving no hint of the treasures inside. But to those who had studied it for months, every detail told a story. Delivery schedules, guard rotations, street patterns, and even the direction of the wind. All of it was meticulously observed and recorded. The operatives assigned to the mission knew that this small building contained files that could rewrite narratives and shift geopolitical calculations. The archive was vast. Hundreds of files, digital media, and sensitive documents were believed to be stored inside. These were not just technical schematics or operational logs. They were the inner workings of a nation's nuclear ambitions, memos between scientists, internal communications, financial records, and reports detailing decades of research. Some were mundane, others could have explosive implications if leaked. To the world outside, they could appear as dry intelligence, but for those who understood their value, they were priceless insight into the structure, priorities, and vulnerabilities of Iran's nuclear program. Planning for the operation was exhaustive. Months of surveillance, satellite imagery, and human intelligence had identified the warehouse as the most likely location of the so-called archive. Operatives had mapped every entrance, exit, and potential route. They had observed guard schedules repeatedly, noting the smallest patterns, the pause at a corner, the brief inspection of a delivery truck, the occasional slip in routine. Each movement, no matter how slight, was logged and analyzed. The operatives themselves were experienced, trained to operate in hostile urban environments. They understood that Tehran was one of the most surveilled cities in the world. Every streetlight could conceal a camera, every shop window could host an observer, and every neighbor could be an unknowing witness to their movements. They rehearsed the approach repeatedly in safe houses that mimicked the warehouse layout, testing entry methods, timing, and escape plans. They simulated contingencies for every possible scenario: patrols, mechanical failures, unexpected witnesses, or alarms triggered accidentally. And yet, despite this preparation, the mission was far from certain. The greatest risk was not always external. Inside the warehouse, hidden among the safes and cabinets, could lie unforeseen dangers. Advanced security mechanisms, undocumented traps, or even variables introduced by human error. A misaligned lock or a miscounted step could compromise the operation, and in a city like Tehran, compromise was not merely an embarrassment. It could be fatal. Time was critical. The window for action was narrow, dictated by the predictable rhythm of the guards, rotations and the cycle of the city's nighttime calm. Operatives moved like shadows, their footsteps measured, breaths controlled, every movement deliberate. They understood that failure was permanent and that the warehouse's contents could not be recovered once removed and detected. The psychological pressure on the team was immense. They were not simply breaking and entering. They were confronting the invisible presence of a state security apparatus, one that had eyes everywhere and could respond within moments. Every steel door, every locked safe, every shadowed corner carried with it the weight of potential exposure. Even the slightest hesitation or error could trigger a chain reaction, ending the mission in disaster. Yet the operation was not just about what could be stolen. It was about the broader impact, the leverage gained by possessing these secrets. The documents could influence global perceptions, shape diplomatic decisions, and send subtle signals across international capitals. In the world of espionage, perception is often as powerful as reality, and this archive was a tool for both. As the operatives approached the first entrance to the warehouse, they paused. The night was silent except for the faint hum of distant traffic, a reminder that the city outside continued its ordinary life. Inside the building, however, the air was thick with tension. The safes waited silently, seemingly inert, yet holding the power to shift narratives and redraw political maps. The operatives knew that within each file could be information that, if misinterpreted or mishandled, could spark crises far beyond the city's borders. Every detail had been rehearsed, yet the unknown variables remained. Which locks would prove more challenging than anticipated, which documents contained the most sensitive information, and, crucially, who within Iran might have inadvertently facilitated the operation. These questions haunted the team as they prepared to breach the steel doors, the answers hidden until the mission unfolded. Outside, Tehran remained oblivious. The guards, the neighbors, the city itself, unaware that a silent storm was gathering in the Shorabad district. Inside, operatives checked their equipment, whispered confirmations, and began the final approach. The night stretched before them, heavy with anticipation, the faint glow of streetlights barely illuminating the shadows in which they moved. And as they reached the first safe, one thought dominated their minds. In espionage, it is often the unseen, the hidden, and the unpredictable that determines the outcome. One misstep, one variable left unchecked, could unravel months of planning. Yet the mission had to succeed. The secrets inside the warehouse were more than intelligence. They were leverage, strategy, and power in tangible form. The clock ticked toward dawn. The city outside continued its slumber, unaware of the silent operatives moving among its streets. The safes stood firm, guarding their secrets, waiting for the moment they would reveal the stories within. And within those stories lay the truth of a nation's ambitions, the shadow wars that had been waged unseen, and the knowledge that espionage is not simply about stealing files, but about controlling the narrative that surrounds them. The night of the heist was about to begin, and with it, a shadow war would unfold in silence, far from the eyes of the world. The first chapter of this operation, the approach, the tension, the careful measurement of time and space, had been set. The rest would reveal itself in the hours to come, one steel safe at a time, each holding a piece of Tehran's most guarded secrets, The unknown variable still lingered inside the warehouse, unseen, waiting, and it would determine not only the success of the mission, but the fate of those who dared to enter the shadows of Tehran. The clock struck 10:30 p.m. in Tehran. The streets of Shariati district had fallen into that uneasy silence that only great cities know, the kind that hums faintly with electricity, the kind that waits. On the surface, it was just another cold January night in 2018, but beneath the calm, a storm was forming in the narrow veins of the city. Two white vans moved slowly down the quiet streets, their headlights dimmed. Inside, men in black overalls sat in complete silence. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. No uniforms, no flags, no insignias. Each man carried only one thing that mattered: precision. In their ears, faint whispers of Hebrew murmured through encrypted radios. In front of them, a digital map glowed faintly, displaying one red dot. A warehouse on the edge of Tehran's industrial district. That was the target. The team leader, calm and deliberate, checked his watch. Every second was measured. At 10:47 p.m., the convoy split in two. One van continued down the main road, a decoy. The other turned sharply into an alley, disappearing into the darkness. Inside the second van, the air was heavy. Every breath was rehearsed, every movement pre-planned. The men were about to attempt something audacious. Breaking into one of the most secretive archives in Iran, a facility no outsider was ever meant to see. Their objective: steal 1/2 ton of classified nuclear documents before dawn and vanish without a trace. The target was no ordinary building. From the outside, it looked like a storage warehouse, dull, metallic, unassuming. But beneath its thick walls lay rows of safes containing the heart of Iran's nuclear past. For years, intelligence agencies had debated whether the archive even existed. Inside those safes were the blueprints, the calculations, and the handwritten notes of scientists who had once dreamed of a bomb. Tonight, that myth was about to be tested. At precisely 11:15 p.m., the team parked near the eastern wall. The driver switched off the lights. The engine hummed once and went silent. Outside, the air was cold, the kind that cut through gloves. Tehran slept, unaware that a covert operation was unfolding just a few blocks away. The men stepped out, their boots barely touching the ground. They moved like shadows. One of them placed a small device against the steel gate. A heat sensor, silent and exact. The numbers on its screen blinked, 42 degrees C, cooling fast. No motion inside. The guards had likely made their last patrol 20 minutes earlier. The team leader signaled. The first lock was bypassed in 30 seconds. The gate opened just enough to slip through, and they entered the compound. Every man carried his role like muscle memory. One watched the perimeter, another disabled the few visible cameras using a frequency jammer. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil, the smell of old machines. At the heart of the warehouse stood two massive doors, black and bolted. Behind them were 32 safes, each filled with documents, discs, and photographs. Their instructions were clear. They had 7 hours before sunrise. Everything not removed by then would be lost forever. Midnight approached. A cutting torch hissed in the dark, its blue flame reflecting off steel. Sparks flew, tiny suns in the cold air. The men worked fast, but silence was their religion. They had trained for this moment for months, learning the layout, rehearsing entry routes, memorizing the safe positions. What they didn't know was whether Iran's security apparatus would react faster than their plans. Each safe was heavier than expected. Older, designed in the 1990s with analog complexity. Cracking them open was an art, not science. One by one, the vaults surrendered to heat and time. Inside were files written in Farsi, stamped with government seals, marked with years long past, 1999, 2002. 2003. Each page a whisper from an era of ambition and secrecy. They photographed the first batch, then quickly switched to extraction. Instead of copying everything, they decided to take the originals. The logic was brutal, but simple. Paper could not be forged with the same authenticity. Each file was placed into metal cases, carefully sealed and labeled. Time was their enemy, but discipline was their weapon. Outside, a car passed by slowly. The team froze. Through the thin walls, they could hear the tires crush gravel. A patrol. 2 men inside the vehicle. The car slowed near the gate, headlights brushing the corner of the building. Then it stopped. The men exchanged glances. One reached for his pistol, another held his breath. Seconds stretched. Then, without warning, the car moved on. The silence returned, but their hearts beat louder now. One mistake, one noise, one light at the wrong time. And the mission would end in fire and gunfire. By 2:15 a.m., 20 safes were open. The air inside the warehouse was thick with heat and metal. Sweat ran down their faces despite the winter chill. They worked in pairs, communicating with gestures only. Then, without warning, one of the safes refused to open. It was the oldest one, rusted, layered, almost defiant. The team leader glanced at his watch. 2.5 hours left. He ordered the torch to be pushed harder, the metal glowing red at its edges. The temperature rose dangerously high, setting off an internal heat alarm that no one noticed at first. Miles away, in a small security office linked to the district's surveillance grid, a single operator noticed a blip. The heat signature on one of the buildings had spiked suddenly. He frowned, zoomed in, and saw only a faint glow. He hesitated, unsure whether it was a system glitch or a fire alarm. He made a note, but didn't raise the alert. That hesitation would make all the difference. Inside the warehouse, the safe finally gave way with a metallic groan. The door swung open, revealing stacks of compact discs, photographs, and handwritten ledgers. One of the men smiled briefly. This was what they came for. He slid the contents into a reinforced case. At 3:00 a.m., they were almost done. A faint sound echoed. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a generator. Tehran was beginning to stir. Morning prayers were only 2 hours away. They loaded the last of the cases into the van, sealing the doors silently. But now came the hardest part, the exit. The route had to be perfect. If any checkpoint became suspicious, the mission would collapse instantly. They had contingency plans, but none involved capture. As the convoy moved out, one of the men took a final look at the building. Inside, the safe stood open, smoking from the heat of the torches, like tombs robbed of their secrets. The air was still. The only trace they left behind was a faint smell of burnt metal. The road out of Tehran was long and narrow, dotted with police checkpoints. The men inside the van had memorized every route, every timing, every streetlight. Their forged papers were ready, their cover stories airtight. Still, every passing vehicle made their pulse quicken. At one checkpoint near Karaj, a guard waved the van to stop. The driver smiled calmly, presenting documents that claimed they were technicians transporting industrial parts. The guard shone a flashlight briefly, yawned, and waved them through. The van rolled forward, the city lights fading behind them. When dawn finally touched the horizon, the convoy reached its first safe zone, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts. There, they transferred the documents into unmarked trucks that would head toward the border. The mission was almost complete. Almost. What they didn't know yet was that Iranian intelligence would discover the break-in hours later. Too late to stop it, but soon enough to unleash a political storm that would echo around the world. The men, however, were gone. Their footprints erased, their presence denied. By the time Tehran's officials arrived at the scene, the safe still smoked, the locks melted, and the secrets, once sealed in darkness, were gone, carried away into the cold desert morning. Outside, as the city awoke to its usual noise and movement, no one knew that something extraordinary had just happened in the night. No one noticed that half a ton of history had vanished under their noses. To the men who had pulled it off, it was more than a heist. It was proof that even in the heart of an enemy capital, shadows could move unseen and leave behind only questions. The operation was far from over. The files still had to cross borders, evade patrols, and reach the hands of those who planned it. But for now, they had done the impossible. They had broken into the heart of Tehran and walked out with its most guarded secrets. The first light of dawn began to bleed over the Alborz mountains, painting the horizon in faint silver. Tehran stirred awake, unaware that within its industrial veins, something extraordinary had occurred just hours earlier. Inside a half-burnt warehouse, the scent of scorched metal still hung thick. Security guards who arrived early for their shifts stood frozen, staring at the gaping vaults, at the twisted locks, at the impossible. But the men responsible were already miles away. Their convoy sped west, blending with the morning traffic. The air was sharp and cold, the roads slick with dew. Inside the van, silence reigned. No one dared to speak, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the tension that filled the space between them. Their minds were trained on one truth. The hardest part of the mission wasn't the break-in. It was getting out. The archive's location inside Tehran had made the entry a masterpiece of planning. The escape, however, would test every ounce of calculation, nerve, and luck. The files they carried weren't just paper. They were history, confession, and weapon, all bound in ink and dust. Each page was worth a war. They had to cross hundreds of kilometers through one of the world's most tightly monitored territories without being caught, questioned, or seen. At 6:10 a.m., Iranian security forces discovered the breach. Alarms screamed through the warehouse district. Within minutes, Tehran's police and intelligence divisions were alerted. Surveillance footage showed fragments of motion, blurry silhouettes, partial license plates. By 6:30, roadblocks were being erected on all major exits from the city. The message traveled upward fast. First to local police, then to senior intelligence officers, and within an hour, to the highest corridors of power. The situation was clear. A classified nuclear archive had been breached. But how? And by whom? Meanwhile, the operatives were already deep into their next phase. The convoy had split in two just before dawn. One vehicle continued west toward the border region, while the other turned south, serving as a diversion. Their timing was surgical. Each vehicle's path was synchronized with traffic density, checkpoint schedules, and morning prayer times. They drove through industrial zones, village roads, and quiet highways, places where few looked twice at a passing van. The cases of documents were hidden beneath layers of machinery parts and insulation material, each sealed against moisture and heat. Every precaution had been made for what lay ahead. At 7:45 a.m., the lead vehicle approached its first critical obstacle, a military checkpoint near Kazvin. Dozens of cars had already been stopped. Soldiers in fatigues moved between vehicles, glancing into trunks, checking IDs. The air was heavy with suspicion. Inside the van, the driver's hands were steady. He had been briefed on the persona he was to play, an electrical contractor delivering turbine parts to a factory in Tabriz. His documents, forged to perfection, bore authentic seals and watermarks. When the soldier approached, the driver rolled down the window and smiled. The soldier looked tired, his eyes red from the night shift. He asked routine questions, then motioned for a search. The back doors were opened, revealing crates of metal parts wrapped in grease paper. The soldier tapped one with his rifle, nodded, and stepped back. "Drive safe," he said. The van rolled forward. The driver didn't breathe for another 30 seconds. Then, slowly, he exhaled. Back in Tehran, the investigation spiraled. Analysts examined the footage again and again. They found only faint outlines of men moving in perfect coordination. Whoever they were, they had understood the city better than anyone. No explosions, no alarms, no witnesses, just precision. Iranian officials ordered road closures toward the western borders. Drones were scrambled, vehicles stopped at random. The hunt had begun, but the trail was cold. By mid-morning, the convoy reached a remote point in the countryside where the two vehicles reconvened. There, hidden among olive groves, a small field base awaited. It was nothing more than a farmhouse, old and quiet, but inside, satellite uplinks and encrypted radios hummed softly. The team transferred the archive cases into reinforced containers. A second crew, fluent in local dialects, was waiting. Their mission: to drive the files to a covert airstrip near the border before dusk. From there, the operation would cross into friendly airspace, and the documents would vanish from Iranian soil forever. At 10 a.m., one of the operatives stood outside the farmhouse, scanning the horizon. The field stretched endlessly, gold and green beneath the morning light. It should have felt safe, but in his chest, something shifted. An instinct. Minutes later, a faint rumble echoed in the distance. Military vehicles. Too soon. Inside, the team scrambled. Radios hissed. A decision had to be made in seconds. They couldn't risk confrontation. The mission was too valuable to end in a firefight. So they split again. 3 operatives stayed behind to misdirect pursuit while the main transport pressed on. The men who stayed behind were ghosts now, destined to vanish into the chaos they'd created. They set decoy signals, leaving behind equipment and traces meant to confuse investigators. Then, as the military trucks neared, they melted into the countryside. By the time the soldiers reached the farmhouse, the field was empty. Only a few footprints remained. At noon, the main transport approached the last stretch of Iranian territory. The border region was tense, dotted with watchtowers and patrols. The plan relied on precision timing. A brief window when radar coverage would shift, creating a narrow corridor for escape. The truck carrying the archives moved through back roads, avoiding main highways. Every bump on the dirt path felt like an earthquake. Inside, the cases rattled softly, their contents priceless and fragile. One of the men checked his watch. 2 hours to the extraction point. He remembered what their handler had said before the mission. If anything goes wrong, destroy the cargo. No trace. No compromise. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the highest offices were in disarray. Officials demanded answers. How had the archive, once thought impenetrable, been breached? Theories spread. Sabotage, betrayal, even inside help. The country's intelligence agency began detaining warehouse staff, interrogating them in shifts. But the truth had already left the city long before their questions began. Satellite imagery revealed something unsettling. Several vehicles moving westward at unusual speeds, their routes converging toward one point. Orders were issued. Drones launched. At 2:30 p.m., one of those drones spotted a lone truck cutting through a remote road toward the mountains. It matched the pattern. Command authorized an intercept team, but terrain and weather were not in their favor. Strong winds grounded the nearest choppers. The window closed again, just as quickly as it had opened. By 4:00 p.m., the team reached the final rendezvous. A dirt strip hidden between rocky cliffs, known only to a handful of people in the world. There, an unmarked aircraft waited, its engines quiet, its nose pointed west. Every second now felt like a heartbeat in eternity. The cases were loaded in silence. The leader gave one final look at the desert stretching behind them, the endless, unforgiving land that had nearly swallowed them whole. Then he climbed aboard. As the engines roared to life, Dust exploded in all directions. The plane began to move. In that moment, far away, Iranian security forces closed in on the area. But they were minutes too late. The aircraft lifted off the ground, its silhouette shrinking into the golden haze. They had made it. By the time darkness fell again, the files were already out of Iranian airspace. The operatives vanished, their names erased from every record, their routes sealed under layers of deniability. Only one phrase would echo later among intelligence circles: the impossible mission that worked. Inside the crates lay the silent spoils of the operation. Over 50,000 pages of documents, thousands of CDs and photographs. Each one a piece of a puzzle that had haunted geopolitics for years. But beyond the triumph, questions loomed. What would the world do with these revelations? Who would believe them? And how far would the truth reach before being rewritten by politics? For now, that didn't matter. In the cold light of another dawn, far from Tehran, the men finally allowed themselves to breathe. They had escaped with the most guarded secrets of a nation and lived to disappear again. The plane touched down in the early hours of the morning, far from Iranian airspace. The world beneath was still wrapped in darkness, unaware that a new storm was quietly forming. Inside the unmarked aircraft were boxes of secrets. Hundreds of kilograms of documents, disks, and blueprints that told a story too big, too dangerous to belong to one nation alone. The men who had carried them across borders sat in silence as the engines cooled. No words, no celebration. They knew the mission was complete, but their war was not over. What they held now wasn't just intelligence. It was power, the kind that could move governments, shift alliances, and ignite tensions across continents. The archive was handed over to handlers in a secure compound. Doors closed, locks turned, and the documents disappeared again. This time into the hands of analysts and translators who worked through the night. Within hours, they began decoding handwritten notes, examining blueprints, and verifying technical data. Every page carried traces of something that had been hidden for over a decade. The full extent of Iran's nuclear ambitions from years before. But the question lingered. What would be done with it? Would it be shared quietly among allies, or used as a public weapon in the next global standoff? In Tehran, the shockwave hit like thunder. News of the break-in spread rapidly through the intelligence hierarchy. The mood in the capital turned grim. Officials inspected the gutted warehouse. Its safes melted, their secrets turned to smoke. The men on site could only stare at what was left behind. Nothing but scorched walls and the bitter smell of failure. For Iran, it was not just a breach of security, it was humiliation. The operation had struck at the heart of secrecy itself. Investigations were launched overnight. Security officers were detained, interrogated, and replaced. Entire divisions were reshuffled. But the truth was impossible to change. Their archive was gone. And somewhere beyond the borders, their secrets were already being translated, scanned, and filed under a single word: evidence. Weeks later, whispers began circulating among journalists and diplomats. Something had been taken from Tehran. Something big. But the details were elusive, guarded, and deliberately veiled. When the story finally reached the public, it came wrapped in performance. A stage set for maximum impact. Months after the operation, a press conference was called. Under bright lights and a carefully prepared backdrop, the documents were revealed, not as raw intelligence, but as proof, presented to the world as a warning. The speaker claimed that what lay inside those binders was undeniable evidence that Iran had once pursued nuclear weapons under the guise of a civilian program. He spoke with certainty, showing diagrams, blueprints, and photographs. Cameras flashed, headlines erupted. The world watched. But behind the spectacle, the story was more complex. Analysts and independent experts would later debate the origins and interpretations of the documents. Were they conclusive proof or selective fragments meant to serve a narrative? Were they a revelation or a message? For intelligence agencies, the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that the operation had succeeded in doing what few missions ever could: shifting perception. Inside Iran, the fallout was immediate. Layers of secrecy tightened further. Security reforms swept through intelligence circles. Those suspected of negligence or compromise were dismissed or vanished quietly. New systems were built, new vaults reinforced, and surveillance doubled across sensitive facilities. But the damage was deeper than walls or files. The country's leadership knew that the message sent by the heist was far more powerful than the documents themselves. It said, "Your secrets can be touched. Your shadows are not safe." That realization sparked paranoia within institutions that once trusted only themselves. Conversations grew cautious. Phones were turned off during meetings. Even the most loyal officers began to question how such an operation had gone undetected for so long. Some suspected internal betrayal. Others believed technology had advanced beyond their defenses. No one could say for sure. The fear lingered long after the safes were rebuilt. In the months that followed, global diplomacy shifted. Negotiations trembled under the weight of the stolen information. Agreements that once seemed stable began to fracture. New alliances formed in silence. Intelligence reports circulated through embassies and war rooms, each claiming a different interpretation of the files. In some capitals, the operation was hailed as a triumph of intelligence. In others, it was condemned as a violation of sovereignty. But beyond the politics, one truth remained. The heist had changed the game. The stolen archive became both a trophy and a weapon. It justified actions, influenced treaties, and shaped how nations viewed one another. Yet, for the operatives who risked their lives in Tehran's darkness, none of that mattered. Their faces remained hidden, their names erased. They existed now only as whispers in corridors where the lights never go out. Years later, the Tehran heist would still be studied in intelligence schools around the world, not for its moral implications, but for its precision. It was, in many ways, the perfect operation. No casualties, no alarms, no traces. A mission completed entirely in the shadows and revealed only when it served a purpose. But those who looked closer saw something else. The cost of silence. The operation had not just exposed a nation's secrets. It had rewritten how truth itself could be used. Intelligence had become theater. Espionage had become narrative. The lines between revelation and manipulation blurred until they were indistinguishable. In the end, it wasn't about who stole what or even why. It was about control. The control of information, of perception, of belief. Back in Tehran, the warehouse still stood, its walls blackened and silent. Locals passed by it every day, unaware of what had once been hidden there. For them, it was just another building in a city full of ghosts. But for those who knew, it was a monument, not to failure, but to the eternal war fought in silence, in code, in shadows, and somewhere far away, behind closed doors, the files sat quietly in digital vaults, every page scanned, every word archived. They would be revisited again and again, each time revealing new layers of interpretation, new reasons to act, new narratives to tell. In the invisible world of intelligence, nothing ever truly ends. Operations leave echoes. Secrets become stories, and stories, when told at the right time, can move nations. The Tehran archive had done exactly that. As the camera of history pulled back, the men who carried out the mission faded once more into obscurity. They would never be named, never photographed, never thanked. Their legacy would live only through the operation itself. A mission that began in silence, ended in smoke, and changed the balance of power without a single shot fired. Somewhere, perhaps years later, one of them might glance at a headline about the aftermath and smile faintly, not in pride, but in understanding. For in the world they lived in, truth was not truth until someone decided what it meant. And so the Tehran Heist became legend, a story whispered between agents, studied in briefings, and debated by diplomats. But like all great operations, the most important details would remain hidden forever, locked not in safes, but in the minds of those who vanished into the night. If you thought this mission was wild, wait until you hear about the next one. A story of betrayal and deception buried deep within another nation's intelligence war. Subscribe so you don't miss the next classified file.